This comes from anthropological work that was done in Papua New Guinea. There's a population there called the Kaluli, who have this astonishing ritual that has been called the burning of the dancers. Let's say a chieftain is lost and the village is beside itself with grief. In 3 days' time, a neighboring village will come for a visitation. The mourners come and sit in the middle. The visiting tribe come out as dancers in the evening. And as the drummers drum and the dancers dance, the bereaved begin to grieve and wail and rock back and forth. And when the intensity becomes absolutely overwhelming and they're shrieking in their grief, the mourners can take a fiery torch, still hot from these fire pits, and put out these flames on the bodies of the dancers. I mean, this seems absolutely grotesque to us. You didn't lose anybody. Why would you put yourself through this? Yet at the conclusion of this ritual, everyone bands together to eat and drink and celebrate the fact that they have created this reformative, restorative ritual. And an especially good ritual is one in which much dancing and much burning has happened. Now, what strikes me as being incredibly important about this ritual is that it acknowledges that in every grief is a violence that must be released.
Andrew Shepard. This is the Converging Perspectives podcast. So in today's world of highly polarized viewpoints on many topics, getting to a conscious conversation has become quite difficult. There are a lot of issues that are hot button issues for people, personal to them. It's basically, this is a sacred issue to me because a family member died because of this issue. Like, a family member died from birth control or a vaccine or something. Like, these things become of sacred issues to people because it impacted them so deeply. And so when you're talking to somebody and you're like, well, this person's usually logical about things, I can't understand why I'm not able to penetrate with logic. They basically just defend. It's irrational. How could that be? We need to remind ourselves that none of us are rational most of the time. We are elephants with a rider on top, rationalizing all of our instinctive decisions. But particularly when there's trauma, it's even harder. There's possibly no way to reach that person logically on that issue.
Right. Well, you use the term sacred issues, and I would suggest that grief is always a sacred issue. And that is one of the areas in which we refuse to go. We refuse to acknowledge the sacredness of grief. And what do we mean by the sacred? It means that it's numinous. It's so big that it transcends our ego's ability to handle it, to fathom it, which is what makes it sacred. It's bigger than we are. And so the grief issue, I think, is one that we really need to focus on. I mean, the role of emotions in rationality has been talked about for millennia, but specifically the emotion of grief in conversation is something that I would like to talk about.
So many examples that we could draw from. I mean, obviously, Israeli-Palestinian conflict been going on for decades. Anyone with family directly involved with that probably has just got a ton of grief connected to that issue.
Our mutual friend, Julia Mossbridge, wrote a beautiful short essay a few days after October 7th, the Hamas attack on the Israeli Music Festival. And she had some fascinating things to say. I mean, even the title of her essay, she called it The Privilege of Vehemence and the Power of Grief, which is right away, you recognize that there's some tension here. But let me just read you a paragraph of what she said, because it's so pertinent to what we're opening up here. She said, even when we're not in personal touch with tragedy, humans are always coming from some emotional state. You've already mentioned that. It's like complete logic and non-emotional is not possible for human beings. But she said, I was wondering whether the emotional remove of vehemence makes people better able to discern a correct or useful response, but it doesn't. The emotional remove can be helpful, though usually it's false or incomplete. But the real problem is the intensity of the rational conviction, the certainty, right? The vehemence of certainty. She said, no one can discern anything if they think they already know everything. There's no room for discernment. And this is what she was so incredulous about after October 7th, and then the Israeli response to that, and all the people who were outraged at the response. She reminds us of what happened after September 11th here in America, that our outrage, our feeling of having been attacked and emotionally wounded. She said the people close to that who'd lost loved ones in the towers, something was activated that could not be rational because that's not how human beings are built.
Right.
And the vehemence of certainty of we know what the correct response to this should be from the clear-minded ones is just aggravating as hell. And it cannot reach those who are in the place of grief. There is no bridge that will reach that place because grief inherently has a violent retribution, vengeance quality to it that we simply need to acknowledge is there. And it's not just human beings, although we've taken it farther. A lot of animals show this quality, that when they are attacked, there is an immediate yearning for revenge or an outpouring of some kind of retaliatory vengeance. It's something about how humans are hardwired.
Which is why we do this so often, this irrational response where it's like, oh, well, some heads have to roll, right? It's like the reason that this systemic problem of abusing women in the workplace is happening is because of a long history of cultural bias and all these different factors. But we're going to fire this guy because he's the representative of this sin.
Oh,
And
okay.
that'll make
That's
us feel
good.
better, right?
Because what you've just pointed to is the scapegoat, which goes
Right.
back so long in history. And indeed, human sacrifice or an animal sacrifice are tied up in the archetype of the scapegoat. But go deep. What is the initial trigger for that? Something has come undone. Something has been violated, something has been lost, something has been attacked. There has been some significant wounding that has thrown the community off balance. And it's this yearning to get back into balance again that I think is the deepest underlying motivator for the yearning towards vengeance.
And isn't that emotional desire to sort of restore this concept of justice somehow? To bring
Yes.
the
Yes.
idea of justice back to society, to restore
Yes.
justice. But what we do instead of actually working on the systems that create justice is we do a sacrificial lamb. We do, a token of justice that somehow pleases the mind and
it
the
does.
emotions.
I mean, that's the significant thing. The ritual scapegoating, in fact, relieves the pressure. It's like you've taken a little bit of that steam out of the pot so it doesn't explode. So scapegoating and sacrificial rituals were actually devised to protect the tribes from completely annihilating each other in blood feuds. It was an advance on what was even earlier part of the vengeance cycle of the blood feuds. So you have to recognize these incremental steps. But the yearning to restore the balance, which is the basis of restorative justice, hadn't quite gotten there, right? I mean, the urge, the instinct is correct, but the way they played it out was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which, as the sage remarked, will leave the whole world blind, right?
Right.
Eye for an eye, eye for an eye. If you keep doing that, eventually nobody has eyes.
Right.
Everybody's had their eyes poked out because this harm leads to that harm, leads to that harm. So it's ever escalating cycle of violence. And this is the central problem, the central riddle that human beings have tried to figure out for centuries.
I still remember a friend of ours decades ago now for whom I mentioned this. I feel like it was right after 9/11, but it had to do with Israel and Palestine at the time. And he was very offended that I would use a Jewish proverb from the Old Testament to point out the problem with just reacting and counterattacking people. And I didn't really understand why that was so offensive. I'm like, well, isn't this Jewish wisdom? Isn't this just like this is logic from the Western tradition?
This is logic from the Western tradition. Like, your rabbis may have said it, but we don't want to hear it now because we're not ready for it now. Can we go into some deep mythology?
I think that's where the root of this is. I think that's where we should go.
So there are two things that three different mythologies. And if we then bring the common threads together, I think we're going to find some deep answers to this conundrum. So the first thing that I want to lift up is an indigenous tradition here from the Iroquois Confederacy or the Iroquois League of Nations, the great legend. And we won't call it myth, although it has mythic qualities, because there are some historical records that suggest that these people, Deganawida, Peacemaker, and Hiawatha, were actual people, right? They actually lived. So it's not a complete myth the way fairy tales are stories. Sort of like a King Arthur. This is the King Arthur. And in fact, if we believe the oral tradition, it happens in the 12th century. So it's that iteration. You can look at other mythologies around the world. The 12th century is a very powerful year for the eruption of new ideas. So in this story, Deganawida, Peacemaker, has arrived at a time when the five nations are constantly at war with each other. There is so much blood feud that they've terrorized each other to the point that they cannot have commerce or trade or festivals together because they're just going to slaughter each other. It's gotten so bad that cannibalism has now taken hold. This is like the last straw, right? This is the sign that things are about to fall apart utterly if you are eating your own species. Deganawida, who has, interestingly, a speech impediment, is seeking a spokesperson for his mission of peace. And he decides that Hiawatha is the great spokesperson, the one who can actually bring peace to the nations. But Hiawatha is also caught in this horrible cycle of violence, revenge, and misery, having lost his wife and daughters to the evil one. So Deganawida finds Hiawatha at the side of a lake. Hiawatha is about to commit suicide. And Deganawida pulls him back through this beautiful ritual of comfort. It's a ritual designed to, the word that they translate it is re-quicken the spirit. So this ritual of condolence that involves the gathering of shells and the saying of words to provide comfort that are very specific to the story of the bereaved one. So Hiawatha's losses are enumerated in great detail for each of the family members who's been torn away through murder. And it's only after this great condolence ritual that Hiawatha comes back into his clear mind. So there's laying on of hands and storytelling and weeping, and finally he can bring Hiawatha back into his full powers to go forth as peacemakers. And this idea of the condolence ritual continues then through the rest of the story, where they finally confront the evil one and also transform him, and make him the first chief of the United Nations of the Iroquois League, right? So the transformation of the darkest shadow would be like making Darth Vader the new emperor of a peaceful, loving universe, right? You're going to take the darkest one and bring out the light side.
Well, Nelson Mandela basically is that example in more modern history, right? I mean, he's someone who was very much abused.
Yes, who recognized the ability to transform what was happening and turn away from the idea of seeking vengeance into something that was much more transformative. And we'll get to that last, because that's the most recent iteration. Again, what I'm trying to show is that humans have wrestled with this issue and are trying to bring something forward, which is a new process. But let me go back to an even earlier than 12th century, because this is an example that I think absolutely nails the psychological piece. This comes from anthropological work that was done in Papua New Guinea. There's a population there called the Kaluli, who have this astonishing ritual that has been called the burning of the dancers. And very similar to the Iroquois, Huron, and Onondaga tribes, they have taken the grief ritual to incredible lengths. If someone loses an important, let's say a chieftain is lost and the village is beside itself with grief, in 3 days' time, a neighboring village will come for a visitation, which is going to be announced. It is known when the visitation happens. The visiting tribe brings all of their young, strong men. The women bring lots of food. They set up a special tent or lodge. And those who have been bereaved, the mourners, come and sit in the middle of that tent space. And then the visiting tribe come out as dancers in the evening. And there are fires lit and torches that the mourners have in these little fire pits in the lodge. And as the drummers drum and the dancers dance, the bereaved begin to grieve and wail and rock back and forth. And when the intensity becomes absolutely overwhelming and they're shrieking in their grief, the mourners can take a fiery torch, still hot from these fire pits, and put out these flames on the bodies of the dancers, significantly burning their flesh. And this goes on until all of the fires have been put out and the grief has sort of burned down, literally burned down. I mean, this seems absolutely grotesque to us. It's almost insane. You didn't lose anybody. Why would you put yourself through this? The neighbors coming to dance and be burned. And yet at the conclusion of this ritual, everyone bands together to eat and drink and celebrate the fact that they have created this reformative, restorative ritual. And an especially good ritual is one in which much dancing and much burning has happened. And then this will be talked about for years, how much dancing and burning went on. Now, what strikes me as being incredibly important about this ritual is that it acknowledges that in every grief is a violence that must be released. That's what that ritual is telling us, that these people understood grief is not just sadness. Tears alone are insufficient. There is a violent reaction to a loss. And the only way to expatiate it is to allow that violence to come forth. And so if there are other human beings willing to take it on, that will allow that grief to be discharged. Now, this may seem like a really extraordinary example, but I think it's essential to understand where that's coming from. Because this kind of ritual binds those villages together. Right now, there's no chance that there will be violence between these people who have willingly taken on the painful grieving of another tribe. That's a form of bonding, like that we're now blood brothers because we have suffered together. Pasión, we have suffered together. So I think that this is really an important understanding, and that forms the basis of what we can look at of how different human societies have tried to wrestle with that component of the violence, the anger against loss and grief.
Yeah, well, I think
Yeah.
usually grief is covered by anger, by men in particular. Men usually cover their sadness or grief with anger, so they're intrinsically linked, I would suspect. And
Yes.
you're right. And the grief is like it's like a knife in the heart that's like constantly
Yes. Oh,
causing
and
pain.
the poets tell that all the time. That's what grief feels like. And so, in order to balance, somebody else also has to feel a knife in the heart or a torch on the leg, whatever. Someone else needs to pick up some of this because it's not okay for me to carry it alone.
Right. Now, I may be getting ahead of us here to bring up the concept of toxic empathy, but like I feel like going and getting burned by my neighbors in order for them to get over their grief is a bit much.
Okay. It is a bit much because what Joseph Campbell might say is this is the metaphorical idea concretized. So, can we take it metaphorically and rather than concretizing it, in taking the actual blows? I mean, in some grief rituals, you're ripping your clothes and beating your breast, right? Trying to damage yourself.
Right.
Instead of doing that, is there some other way? And I believe there is. Just as a quick aside here, on Easter Sunday, I sat for an hour and a half and watched a very beautifully done video documentary of Hurricane Helene striking Asheville, North Carolina last September. And I did that because my sister and niece were affected by that storm in very real ways. And the trauma they experienced, they are still living with. And the last time my sister visited me, she said, if you didn't live through it, you simply don't understand it. We are all still having PTSD. And I realized that the generous acts that I had done to support my sister and niece were not engaging me emotionally. They were rational acts. Start a GoFundMe campaign, send condolence messages, whatever. That in order to really grieve with them, I needed to at least vicariously come to some understanding of what it was they went through. So Easter Sunday morning, I'm spending that time very carefully witnessing the documentary, which has people and images that take you right into the horror of seeing your family's house tip over the side of an embankment, get washed away down the river and smashed against a tree and break in half. Seeing 11 members of your community drowned and having to put up all of the gravestones all at once, like that, just a catastrophic loss. But it felt so important that I would be willing to go there and sit through that as a witness. So I think this is another stage, but it means that you don't get into arguments about did FEMA do enough? Was the government there? The kind of
That's scapegoating. That's another just form of
the scapegoat,
scapegoating, which
yes.
avoids
And
the
to try to
emotional depth.
avoid, that's right. It's an avoidance technique. Let's talk about what to do now, how we're going to get out of it, how to make, so it won't happen again, blah, blah, blah. That's all taking you away from the necessity of sitting in the grief, which is why so many religious traditions have designated periods for grieving. I mean, when we're doing this interview right now, this is one day after Pope Francis died. And you can find umpteen videos now laying out how the memorializing and grieving process will take place. Right now, there are 24-hour vigils in St. Peter's Square of the faithful on their knees with their rosaries. And that will go on through Saturday when the funeral will be held. So again, part of the value of a religious tradition is setting these grief rituals as automatic. This is what you do. This is where you go. This is what you stop doing. Because the deep wisdom of the ancestors was a recognition that if you don't go into the grief is going to take you over in ways that are terrifyingly violent.
Right. Like scapegoating.
Right, like scapegoating or the bombings that went on after 9/11. We were so infuriated feeling that we had been invulnerable because we were across an ocean, and suddenly seeing our people taken down in a fiery furnace like that. And we lashed out. I mean, we went after vengeance in a big way.
After two countries that really had very little to do with the events.
As it turned out, right. But we were going to scapegoat somebody, by God, because the country needed it. The people need to see that our leaders are taking action. And that's the forefront storyline of so many great novels and movies and what have you.
I still remember this because and not to like, oh, I was so on the right side of history, but I was like, I was like, hey, what the hell are we doing in Iraq? Like, what does that have to do with this? Even if there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which there weren't, it doesn't have anything to do with 9/11.
Right. But of course, that's the rational mind speaking. If you go back to the Gisaro, right, the Kaluli ritual, it doesn't matter that those people weren't responsible for the death of your chieftain. We're going to take out our grief and rage on them because they're willing to let us do that.
If I had lived in New York at the time of 9/11, I might have felt very differently about things. I might have been much more in an emotional state of reaction. But as it was, living in Chicago at the time, I was sad. I was shocked. I didn't quite know how to process everything, but I also felt like the intuitive response was grief. It was sadness and not reaction of violence.
Yeah.
But that's not how most of us felt, perhaps.
Let's take that as the segue to talk about this third myth that I want to talk about, that I think is so important. And this takes us back to the Greeks, which we have to do because so much of Greek mythology and philosophy is what undergirds the entire Western worldview, right? I mean, the Greeks were so much like us. So, University of Chicago philosopher Martha Nussbaum has done just a beautiful interpretation, synthesis, analysis of this Greek myth. But it comes from the Greek playwright Aeschylus in his very famous drama, Orestia. In that play, there are some significant characters. This is a play that talks about the actual founding of Athens and the role that goddess Athena plays in that. There has been this blood feud going back and forth and back and forth, and murders and counter murders and vengeances of all sorts. And at the last act, Athena comes forth and says, that's it. There will be no more of these blood feuds. We are going to establish law in our city. And what she does, and this is so interesting, up to this point, if someone murdered one of your relatives, you had to create a specific curse that would damn them for this evil deed. And the personification of the curses were called the Furies. These were actual images, right? Characters in Greek mythology. These three horrible, demonic hellhounds that were described as having blood dripping from their eyes and vomiting up body parts from the humans they had devoured in their bloodlust for revenge. These are the stuff of nightmares, right? If you got cursed and the Furies were after you, God's help you. And of course they wouldn't, because that was sacrosanct, right? Because payback was important. In order to have balance, you needed to have revenge. So the Furies are these three potent sort of dog wolfhound-like creatures. And significantly, they have no speech. They can howl and whine and yowl, but they are not human at all. If these were characters in a dream, you would say that this energy is in you, but it has not yet been integrated at all. There is no humanness in it. It's very much locked in the shadow. So these Furies are the collective shadow that drive the bloodlust and the endless feuds. Now, what's really important in the story is that Athena says these will be invited into the city. And of course, at first the people are horrified. It's like, why would you invite them in? She said, because they will arrive and be transformed. Now, to me, this is so critical. And Nussbaum puts her finger on it. She said, if you do a quick reading of this and you think, oh, it's because, in fact, that anger and revenge is sort of incorporated into the legal system, right? That we still have that energy of retribution in our legal system, which is true, which is true. She said, but a closer reading of the text shows us that when the Furies come in, they do not come in as hellhounds without speech. They are invited in, and all of the citizens must come forth to greet them and honor them. And as they come into the city, they take on a human shape and are given these beautiful crimson robes to wear. So the 3 wolfhounds become 3 old wise women. They are transformed, they are humanized. And what happens in that transformation is that they give up vengeance. They turn over anger and perform the service of not retribution, but of restoration, right? This is the origin of having evidence brought before a tribunal, of having a jury of your peers, of having a judgment, of having appropriate punishment meted out not by those who are grieving and are therefore not in their right minds, but of a dispassionate state representative. So the anger has been drained out of the loss, of the grief. And now it can rise to a level of restoration, but only after the anger and vengeance have been filtered out through this gradual but conscious process of transformation. So that is what is so significant about that play and that the Greek myth that it's based on, is that we recognized all of these layers of the psyche that needed to be addressed. And that in order to stop the vengeance cycle, the entire community needed to embrace and humanize and, in fact, uplift, ennoble the one who grieves. And this is what we find when we come into probably the best example of how this could work in modern times. If we look at South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation process that was enacted there, right? And the phenomenal importance of Desmond Tutu and his role in establishing how the process would work. And that the most important, the fundamental thing was truth, which, to your point, means that you can't escape. You can't get away from the grief by going directly into anger, denial, revenge, into the head, let's find solutions immediately. To tell the truth means that you stay with the grief. So this is like the great wampum condolence ritual of Deganawida and Hiawatha, right? You sit with the grief and tell it all. Every detail has to come out because there's no other way for the anger to be drained from that emotion until the entire story is told.
And the Fambul Tok tradition, it might have happened after the genocide, the Tutsis and but I'm somehow forgetting the actual context of it. But I know that the process of it was basically that you sit in a circle and the person who is guilty, who's being accused of great sins and violence in the previous administration or power structure, sits there and is told the stories of all the people their actions have harmed, all the family members whose lives were heavily impacted or destroyed by this person's carrying out of their form of justice at the time, which was really injustice from the perspective. They have to sit there and listen, as painful as it may be, to how brutally this has affected so many other people.
Right. Yes. So that's exactly what you're describing is the Truth and Reconciliation process. That the first step was to gather the facts. The second step was to have the perpetrators and the victims sit with witnesses, and the victims got to tell their entire story, and the perpetrators had to listen. But then the critical next piece was that if the perpetrator was willing to take responsibility and seek to be re-entered into the community, they were given absolution. That was the critical piece. You've listened to the testimony against you. You have admitted your role in it. You've told your side of the story, the context of what brought you there, which is critical, because in order not to sin in that way again, you have to understand what it was in your character that allowed you to do these grotesque things to another human being. If it was fear or self-interest or some other kind of cognitive shortcoming, you need to know what it was that allowed you to cross that line of desecrating another human life. And once acknowledged, the implication is that you are sorry and hope to be redeemed. But knowing that if you were willing to confess, you would be invited back into the culture was a critical piece. And Desmond Tutu was emphatic. If we don't have amnesty to hang out there like the carrot, people won't go through with.
Right. There will be no honesty. No one's going to go and say, oh, I won't plead the fifth. I will confess to all of my sins if they're going to be then hung for them.
Right. Right. Or, sent out of the country, which was with the other option. They would just be expelled from the country. So this whole piece is a very careful structure. And of course, you and I did that whole restorative justice training, and it's very, very similar on a much smaller scale. That you, as the trained facilitator and witness, have to sit with the perpetrator or perpetrators and the victims with their respective family, friends, or support team. And the story has to be told and heard and acknowledged. And then the context in which all of this happened can be discussed as well. And then how are we going to restore? How are we going to find balance? What can the perpetrator do to restore to a sense of wholeness what it was that the victim lost in some way, even if it's just symbolic?
And a common use of the restorative justice process in America, in the West, is date rape in college, because a lot of people are, like, both parties were drunk. It's not as clear cut of a crime, or it would be very difficult to try it in the justice system. But basically, these two young people maybe just didn't really know what they were doing, or one of them didn't understand what was going on, understand their responsibility, or what agency really means when someone's inebriated. At what point is that lack of a no not good enough to proceed? Like that type of incident, because it impacted young people's lives so badly. Restorative justice is often implemented when both parties are willing to have a healing, because often just getting acknowledged, not gaslit into saying no, denying your experience exists, is a huge part of the healing that somebody needs to get over the experience that was traumatic for them. Getting that person to go to jail for years wasn't important to that person, because it wasn't that person necessarily was a bad apple. And that's where I think it gets really critical, and why restorative justice is so important is a concept, is that in so many of these circumstances we're talking about, the person who committed the crime wasn't a bad apple. They were part of a system that was pushing them to do so. I mean, go back to the Nazi period and you go, okay, so everyone who appeased the Nazis in Austria and all these, even in Germany, like all these other countries, they were just all bad apples? Or were they decent people who were terrified for their own lives and families if they resisted?
Yeah. It's very sad, because there will certainly need to be truth and reconciliation after the end of the Trump era. Think of all of the people who've already been affected, the people who are, in fact, ICE informers or ICE workers. They have that now on their conscience. They participated in acts of civil strife that are clearly unconscionably unethical and illegal. But they were ordered to do it, and they did. They behaved like Nazis in rounding people up and imprisoning them and sending them away without due process, which any American citizen knows is against the Constitution, right? So there's no excuse like, I didn't know any better. No, every American knows that due process is the foundational linchpin in our entire legal system. And one of the main reasons that our founding fathers went to war with Great Britain in the first place, that we did not want to be rounded up and sent to foreign countries without any semblance of a trial. So yeah, there's going to have to be a lot of reconciliation.
Right.
But again, the reconciliation is part of the process, because ultimately the goal is that the perpetrator is brought back into society as a valued member, which is why restorative justice is so important for youthful offenders, when there's still a chance to get them back on the right track. Because if they feel that there's no way for them to get back into society because they have a stain on their record, like, the mark of Cain, that they'll always be despised, what point? Why should they choose a better path if they've already been sentenced, as it were, by public opinion?
It's like you've basically
critical.
cast them as a villain in the
Yes.
story now, and they're just going to have to play that
That's
out.
right. They're going to have to play the bad guy for the rest of their lives. So yeah, it's hopeful that many states now have a juvenile justice system that insists on a restorative justice option for first-time offenders or minor offenses. And I just wish that that were established in federal law too.
Yeah.
And of course, the conservatives who want to roll that back and insist that 15 and 16-year-olds be tried as adults, it's craziness.
What it really is not taking responsibility for society's role in the problem.
There.
And acknowledging that you can't go to the extreme of just blaming everything on society and every individual is innocent, because if you do that, then you remove the personal responsibility necessary for people to have character.
Right.
So you have to balance those two, but that's always been part of the justice system, is balancing those ideas. But I think the philosophy we're in is still very like Old Testament, pre-Athena, like vengeance is what justice is about, is vengeance to those who have harmed us. And it's just not a viable philosophy for today, because we see so clearly how interconnected everything is, how much this system is doing this. Why are Black people in America disproportionately represented in prisons? Is like, there's a lot of reasons why, and none of them are good. None of them are just or honest. There's not a gene that makes people more criminal. That is insane. So to understand the predatory way the justice system's been being used for so many decades and go, okay, that's not working. We have too many people in prison because we're not approaching justice properly, is, I think, very important. And to understand that restoring justice means mostly getting people back on the same team. This is about maintaining our value system. And that's where I think this segues all back into the conscious conversation with political polarization, is that this is what we're trying to do, is bring us back to realizing we actually are on the same team. Just because you voted for Trump or you voted for Kamala doesn't mean we're enemies. It does not.
So if we take what we've learned about the process of understanding the role of grief in anger, violence, retribution, etc., then we have to take into account the relationship between the collective and the individual, which you already started to talk about. Blaming the individual when it's actually a systemic guilt or a systemic violence is grotesquely unfair, as the disproportionate number of African Americans in prison points out. But where does the responsibility lie? It still lies with the individual. But in this case, it lies not just with the individual who was a perpetrator of violence in a society which is perpetually violent. It lies with the individuals who constitute the larger collective society, who are holding the power, i.e., people like you and me, who are white, well-educated, privileged, vote, stay abreast of the situation. Part of our responsibility is being willing to go and sit in the grief place to understand why people are perpetrating what we consider to be irrational acts of violence. And if we as white liberals had been more willing to sit with the grief of the disenfranchised, non-college educated white rural people or cast off factory workers, and had been willing to identify with their grief and listen to their complaints and understand the anger that was part of that grief, we would not have been so quick to start calling them names and besmirching their character and calling them stupid and irrelevant and whatever, because we would have really come to a deeper understanding of what their grief was. Again, it behooves us as individuals who consider ourselves rational to let go of the need to be rational and go into the place of being compassionate and try to take on some of the actual grief and anger so that we can siphon it off, that we can lower the heat under that pot, under that boiling pot. It's the only humane thing to do. And in fact, it's the only effective way to go into that situation.
So my pro-Israel friends or my pro-Palestinian friends, like I can see there's a lot of emotionally driven need to just see things in a certain way. For me to try to convince those people to be more rational about the thing and like, well, look at this, like there's other data that you should be looking at to be more fair-minded. It's like, it's really a futile attempt in many cases. And it's not helping us as a relationship, because what they need to know is that I get them, is that I get to some degree what they're going through right now with the restimulation of their trauma.
And of course, we can't take on artificial trauma. We can't pretend to have experienced the same trauma that others have felt. And maybe this is our next conversation. How do you relinquish the safety of your emotion-free intellectual niche up here? How do you become more compassionate and empathetic? What are the limitations and possibilities of empathetic listening, of compassionate conversation? Because I think that there's probably a whole progressive technique that needs to be learned in order to do that well, because otherwise it's just performative and people can tell when you're just have a veneer of sympathy, but it's not actually there. You're not actually with them in their dark place.
Yeah, and let's just touch on this right now, because in our training for restorative justice, we did an exercise in which someone has a prompt and they basically tell you the sky is purple. Like it's sky's not blue, it's purple. The sun is green. Basically some ridiculous thing that's absolutely empirically not true. They say it, and your job is to not react in a way like, what are you talking about? You're crazy.
Right.
Because you will in life, and we do get people telling us conspiracy theories that seem not based in reality. It's like, oh, well, the earth is flat. You know that, right? For you to have this emotional reaction of, okay, you're screwing with me, or you're nuts, that completely disconnects you from the other person. That prevents what could be, again, a conscious conversation beginning to take place. It severs it immediately, and then you have no point of contact. The bridge is burned. You're not working on the relationship anymore. And that's what I see so much today, especially if you'd go on to social media and argue with somebody on there. It's like you're already in a fist. You're already not conversing with each other, let alone, building anything like a conscious conversation where something could actually change, where some idea of yours or some idea of theirs could actually come into your consciousness and bring a new idea about.
I wanted to bring something from our friend Julia Mossbridge again at this point, because it was really lovely. She says, from the position of the vehement, right? That's the thinking types who have a certain idea of what should happen now. From the position of the vehement, grief seems weak and useless. That's an important point. But the power of grief is that it is both honest and clarifying. Grief acknowledges a specific tragedy is real, right? That's what you're talking about. You have to honor whatever it is they're saying as being real. It sees and feels the lost potential of lives, the lost possible peace. And because grief arises from love. When we really allow it to move through us, grief turns our discernment toward the good. That sentence is so important. Let me just read it again. Because grief arises from love, right? You understand that's always the case. You wouldn't be in grief unless you had loved the thing which is now lost.
Right. If you have no attachment
Grief,
or connection to something, no identification with
and you're
something,
not grieving.
there's no point to grieve.
Grief arises from love. And when we really allow it to move through us, grief turns our discernment toward the good. It's so beautiful and critical. That's an alchemical statement because it's showing what is activated. The love that is inside grief, from which the grief arose, is what washes the anger and retribution and vengeance through if we allow it to keep moving.
Right.
Like it's going to take all of that silt from the riverbed and wash it through and send it back into the collective, which can hold it, right? So in the Gesaro ritual, there's so much grief and anger and vengeance that it has to have a bigger community to hold it. If the community is willing to hold it, then, and only then, can the anger subside enough that our discernment can turn toward the future, which is where restorative justice is possible. Restorative justice is never possible if you're always looking back over your shoulder at the trauma and the hurt and wanting to be avenged, right? It can only happen when you're looking forward to ask, well, what can we do now to bring ourselves back into wholeness?
I want to back up a smidgen here because in a practical situation where a friend of yours is telling you with vehemence their emotionally, highly, emotionally driven story of reality, which is what's going on, a lot of debate, narrative debate of what's true. And you can tell it's coming from a deeply emotional place, and they're like striking out with it like a weapon. This is what happened, and they did this, and they're so terrible, and they're not even human, and you're doing all this instead of you fighting with them, which is what they're ready for.
Right.
Instead, recognizing, oh, this is coming from a deep emotional place that is true for them at some level. Instead of clashing swords, instead sidestep the sword, Aikido style, and come in closer to them, get closer to like, what is this about for you? Why is this such a powerful, important thing to you? Because I want to know more about who you are. And this seems very important to you.
That's a beautiful description. And metaphorically speaking, that could feel like receiving a blazing torch on your body, because your urge is to rise above all of that anger and rancor and try to find a calm place where we can talk about how to handle it. But if you're willing to stay with that, with the heat, you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Maybe there is a way metaphorically to continue this earnest and deep tradition of being part of the collective that holds the grief container so that people can move through it and keep moving till you get to a place of greater discernment.
I would suggest that it's actually absolutely necessary to some. You might do it differently depending on your stamina or capacity, but these people are not going to move out of that position and conspiracy theory, highly emotionally driven narrative without recognition for their pain.
Exactly. Because they need the truth before anything can become reconciled. They need to speak the truth and have it acknowledged.
And that is why the current debate in the political realm is not working.
We don't have enough grief holders or grief tenders.
I want to just briefly bring up one of my heroes, Daryl Davis, who's a Black jazz musician who's befriended dozens of KKK members and through loving conversation retired, I think, over 30 KKK robes, including a Grand Masters. This respectful conversation and trying to understand what it is about this belief or value is so important to a person. Why is it so personal? Why is it so rich with meaning? That kind of curiosity can lead to a conscious connection that literally breaks down extreme bias, extreme prejudice, extreme racism. These ideas are not who we are. They're not what we are. They are simply passing through us as a vehicle. And once we get healthy again, once we get these emotions out and feel safe again, and feel like we're actually connected to people, and that even the people who don't think the way we do have our backs, that's when the fear dissipates. That's when we can think in a different way again.
And also talk about some of the fabulous work that was done, for instance, by the founder of Sojourners in his work with gangs, and some of the Chicago efforts to reduce gang violence, because there's a lot that we can learn from these groups that are actively finding peace projects. We might even touch into, the Irish problem. Look at Northern Ireland and the ongoing violence, Catholics, Protestants, and how that was able to resolve. Because again, these are not inevitable. Humans have progressed.
Right.
There are signs that we can get smarter and more discerning. But it's hard work, and we have to keep dipping back into the great wisdom pool of storytelling that's trying to keep us afloat in this grand experiment. So let's tell some more of these good stories, because I think we're actually making some headway against the chaos and the confusion and horror and dread and despair sometimes that's gripping us right now.